Hello and welcome to Reviews. As always, I'm Plume Noir. Now, I have not talked about the She-Hulk Attorney at Law show on this channel, even though I always mention that she's my favorite character, because I wanted to wait until we got the final product. In fact, I have not watched anything beyond the first trailer. Yeah, I know a lot of people are talking about it, but I just felt it was too easy to rip on something that was not even finished yet. Well, the first episode dropped today, and after watching it a couple times, it's only about 30 minutes long, I figured it's time that I could share some thoughts about it, and I'll try not to get too spoilery. So, I'll go over a quick review of the episode and share some of my thoughts. Now, the episode begins in the present, whatever that means in the MCU right now, as Jennifer Walters is preparing for a case. She is practicing her closing arguments for a case that she was handpicked for, all while Dennis, a male lawyer at her firm, complains that he should be the attorney and not her. Jen talks with her best friend, a paralegal named Nikki, who is shown to know that Jen is a Hulk. When Nikki leaves the room, Jen turns and breaks the fourth wall to address the audience to say that she doesn't expect the audience to be able to focus on the fun lawyer show until she explains how she got her powers. The show cuts to several months prior, and she is on a road trip with her cousin, Bruce Banner. Instead of being shot by a gangster like in the comics and getting a blood transfusion from Bruce, she ends up getting into a car accident with a post-Endgame Bruce, as he still has his Infinity Gauntlet injuries even in his human form. And they have this accident after they nearly run into a spaceship. Yeah, that's written off with Bruce later saying he should check that out, but it's a little too convenient plot-wise for my taste. It could have been anything. They could have had a deer running in the road, but oh well, maybe it'll come up later. So Bruce and Jen are both injured, and some of Bruce's blood drips into Jen's wounds, kind of like the movie 28 Days Later. The device Bruce uses to keep himself in human form, it's on his arm, it's damaged, so he tells Jen to run because he's leaking radiation. She flees and ends up at a bar where she has an encounter with a bunch of women in a restroom as she tries to get cleaned up. More on that scene later. She steps outside and gets the typical catcall scene, and that's where she first hulks out at the men before Bruce stops her. She wakes up in Mexico at Bruce's hideaway that he and Tony Stark built. You know, the MCU will forever have Tony's ghost hanging over it, won't it? So Bruce explains that he examined her blood and it cured his injuries from Endgame. And what follows is Bruce trying to train Jen at being a Hulk and trying to convince her that she needs to be a hero, while Jen just wants to get back to her old life. That's the majority of the episode, probably a good 20 minutes of it. When she finally does return, and by the way, how long was she in Mexico? Did she have to call her office to take an emergency vacation or something? So she returns home, and we return to the present. And Jen breaks the fourth wall and states that only her family, her best friend Nikki, and the audience knows that she's a Hulk. And she also adds that she was right and Bruce was wrong. So, yeah, there's that. So she's presenting her closing to her case when Titania just busts into the courtroom. Why? Who knows? And this forces Jen to expose her identity and become She-Hulk to defeat her. And Titania was beaten way too easily. Then she returns to the case to give her closing argument and the credits roll. There is a mid-credits scene that pays off to a brick joke from earlier. Now, I won't spoil it, and it's really kind of dumb, but I bet it'll become a meme. Now, I know Titania Maslany, if I'm saying that right, I know she's a good actress. I mean, Orphan Black, anyone? But I'll be honest, I had my doubts about her as Jen Walters, and I will say, I was wrong. I warmed up to her version of Jen. You know, at first I thought that I was kind of stuck on the kind of curly, poofy hair for a while, but I got over that. And I know some people will be put off by the Ally McBeal meets superheroes theme of the show, but that is exactly how some of She-Hulk's previous series were pitched. And I'm perfectly okay with that. I've always said I prefer She-Hulk to be a fun character. Now, there are a few bits that I see people complaining about where it really does seem to push the tropes that we see in more feminist-skewed works. Let's say that. For example, like the group of men outside the bar. But, to be honest, Jen did kind of look like a hooker. And I know people complain that she was shown in other trailers to be better than Bruce at everything. And I can see that. Bruce is expecting his 15-year struggle with his Hulk status to be hard for Jen. But Jen doesn't have the multiple personality disorder that Bruce does. So she is able to immediately be able to control her Hulk form and retain control and change back and forth. Now, I felt this could have been explained in the show, as it's not obvious without knowledge of the comics. Now, Bruce does show that he is holding back though, even if he is annoyed by how quickly she's adjusting. Oh, and that bit about why Jen can control her changes so well, because she always has to control her anger due to things like catcalls and mansplaining, that did make my eyes roll a little bit. But I guess it could work as a callback to Bruce's "That's my secret, Cap, I'm always angry," that line in the first Avengers movie. Now, one thing I'm going to call now. Jen will not choose the name She-Hulk. The press will. Bruce even states that he didn't choose the name Smart Hulk, and that comes up a couple of times. But he also tells Jen that you don't get to choose the name. So, since Jen had to Hulk out in the middle of the courtroom, it's going to be the press is going to dub her She-Hulk, and it'll probably say that she hates the name. I know a lot of people complained about the CGI, and I could see the Shrek comparisons at some points. But I didn't think it was too bad overall, given that it's not done on a blockbuster movie budget. I like how the She-Hulk design does harken back to John Byrne's style. She's thin, but just a little bit muscular with big hair. I kind of like that. But the hair never looked quite right when she was CGI She-Hulk. The scenes where She-Hulk's hair is tied up, it looks much better than when it's down and over her shoulders. It looked very plasticky. And anytime they interacted with real world objects, looks very off. The clap shockwave scene that She-Hulk does when she's imitating Bruce, it looks silly. And the yoga scene just looked cartoony. But I do have a big complaint though, and I said I'd come back to it. It's the bathroom scene. Now, I noticed this on my first viewing, but on the second viewing, it really bothered me. You see, Jen is in the restroom in torn, bloody clothes when the women come in and they seem concerned. They're asking what happened and that whoever did that to her doesn't care about her and she doesn't need them. And then the girls start cleaning her up and giving her a makeover and even volunteering clothes, like a spare set of shoes. I found this scene very disturbing when I watched it the second time because it looks like they just encountered a victim of an assault. And I'll watch my language here for YouTube. And as I said, her clothes were even bloody and torn, and they just clean her up and send her on her way. No one thought to, call the police. That scene stuck out really badly. And like I said, I noticed it on the first viewing, and so I knew it was coming when I watched it the second time, and it just looked worse. It really, that scene should have been filmed a little bit differently. Oh, and one last thing. I have a theory. I think that the MCU Jen was blipped by Thanos and was gone for 5 years. Now you see, at the beginning of the flashback in the car, Bruce is wrapping up a story about his arm healing and how he built the device to maintain his human form. To which Jen says it was a very long answer to the "what have you been up to" question. Now, I'll admit, this may be a reach and Bruce was just over-explaining, but I couldn't help but think that the reason for the road trip was because Jen had returned from being dusted, and she, or maybe Bruce, decided to have a road trip to catch up, and we only heard the tail end of Bruce's explanation of the Infinity Saga. But that's just a theory. She-Hulk... No, don't do that. Don't ever do that again. So what did I think of the show? It wasn't bad. Of course, I did go in with low expectations, but overall, I'm okay with it. However, it is an origin episode, and I'm not a big fan of those, but it really needed to be done. So I'm really curious to see what happens when the show moves into the courtroom aspect, the attorney at law part. And now that Jen's identity is publicly known, but that's really not a big thing in the MCU. Pretty much everyone's identity is publicly known. So, well, except Spider-Man now, I guess, but spoilers. But I feel that the show is lighthearted enough to match the tone of some of the previous series, and Jen has just the right amount of snark, I guess you could say. I'm really curious to see if the show is going to lean toward sitcom or comedy drama like Ally McBeal did. We'll find out in the coming episodes, I suppose. Now, you can't see my hand, but if I were to rate this episode, I would give it about I'd say a 130 rating on my clock scale, which I guess you would put at about 4 out of 5 stars on a star scale. If you're just an MCU person and not into the comic character, you may not like this as much, especially if you're expecting something more serious. But given how the comics were treating Jen for the past 6 years or so, it's really nice to see that the MCU decided to draw their inspiration from her classic version. So, I'm going to be honest, I'm going to watch the next episode. I'm in, and I'm not going to cancel my Disney Plus here soon, at least until the series is done. So those are just my thoughts on the episode. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time.